Washington was buzzing with tension on that frigid January morning. The White House corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and hushed conversations as Donald Trump paced the Oval Office, his face filled with worry. The newspaper headlines spread across the presidential desk told a story no politician wants to see. Trump's popularity plummets after new round of tariffs, markets panic over trade war, international allies question U.S. strategy. The president stood at the window, looking out over the snow-covered gardens. His tax policies had created a devastating domino effect, trading partners retaliating, American companies suffering, and the public beginning to question his decisions. "Mr. President," his chief of staff's voice cut through the silence. "The poll numbers are in." "They're not encouraging." Trump turned, already knowing the news would be bad but still feeling the weight of reality hit him like a hammer. If you follow the backstage of power, you know that moments like this define entire presidencies. Leave your opinion in the comments on how leaders should deal with popularity crises, and don't forget to subscribe to follow this political saga that is just beginning. The aides gathered in the Roosevelt Room, a thick atmosphere hanging over the mahogany desk. Charts and statistics were spread out like cards from a losing game, each number confirming what everyone else was afraid to admit. "We need a completely new strategy," the press secretary said, nervously adjusting her glasses. "Conventional tactics are not working. People are tired of empty promises." The national security advisor held up his hand, interrupting. "The international situation complicates everything. We have Ukraine bleeding in a brutal war with Russia, Israel, and Palestine tearing each other apart. The world is on fire." Trump slammed his fist on the table, rattling the water glasses. "You were hired to solve problems, not bring me more of them. I want solutions, not excuses." For 3 weeks straight, the presidential team worked tirelessly. Meetings stretched into the early hours of the morning, strategies were drawn up and discarded, outside consultants were brought in and dismissed. Each proposal seemed more desperate than the last, million-dollar advertising campaigns that sounded artificial, public events that attracted more protests than supporters, speeches that fell flat on the face of popular indifference. "It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline," the communications director muttered after yet another failed attempt. The frustration was palpable, seasoned professionals feeling like amateurs faced with a seemingly insurmountable challenge. That's when Sarah, the young digital media consultant, timidly raised her hand during a particularly tense meeting. What if we thought outside the box?" "Completely outside?" Eyes turned to her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Hollywood," she said simply. "We need Hollywood. Not politicians trying to be entertainers, but true masters of storytelling." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, a smile began to form on Trump's face. Maybe, just maybe, the solution lay where no one had thought to look, in America's dream factory. The call came that afternoon. On the other end of the line, in an office overlooking the Hollywood Hills, the phone rang insistently until a familiar voice answered. It was Jerry Bruckheimer, the man behind generation-defining hits. "Mr. Bruckheimer," the presidential aide's voice shook slightly. "The President of the United States needs your help. This isn't about a movie, it's about saving a presidency." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for endless seconds. Hollywood has always had a complex relationship with politics. Stars support causes, producers fund campaigns, writers shape public opinion through their stories. But this was different. It was a direct request from the highest power in the land. "Interesting," Bruckheimer murmured, drumming his fingers on the glass table. "You want me to treat the presidency like a blockbuster in crisis? A movie that needs saving in post-production?" The meeting was scheduled for the next day, in a discreet location, a private studio in Burbank, away from the prying eyes of the press. Confidentiality was paramount. If word got out prematurely, it would be a scandal of epic proportions. Bruckheimer did not come alone. Alongside him walked legendary figures from the industry: Michael Bay, known for transforming any story into a visual spectacle; Ridley Scott, a master of creating memorable epics; and Christopher Nolan, the genius behind complex narratives that captivate global audiences. "Gentlemen," Trump greeted them personally, a rare thing for someone in his position. "You have created some of the most defining moments in American culture. Now I need you to create something even greater, a turning point in my story." Bay was the first to speak, gesturing excitedly as he always did. "Mr. President, every great story needs action, explosions, drama. But it also needs something the audience can root for. What's your hero moment?" The question echoed around the room like a well-aimed shot. Trump, accustomed to leading meetings, found himself in the unusual position of listener. These men were not politicians trying to please him, they were artists analyzing his performance with a clinical eye. "The problem," Scott continued in his slow, reflective voice, "is that the audience has lost the emotional connection to his narrative. They no longer see the protagonist, they only see the politician." Nolan leaned forward, his eyes shining with the intensity of someone who had just had an epiphany. "We need a non-linear structure to show not just what's happening, but why it's happening. Context is everything." "You're talking in terms of cinema," the chief of staff interrupted, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "But this is real politics, with real consequences." Bruckheimer smiled, the same smile that had preceded such hits as Top Gun and Pirates of the Caribbean. "My dear, politics has always been entertainment. The difference is that you have forgotten how to entertain." The room fell silent as the truth of that statement sank in. Decades of successful campaigns, charismatic presidents, nation-defining moments, they all had cinematic elements in common. "So," Trump finally broke the silence, "you're saying we need to treat this like a production? With a script, direction, cast?" "Exactly," the four directors replied almost in unison. And it was at that moment that the most audacious plan in American political history was born, to transform a presidency in crisis into the greatest spectacle the world had ever seen. The operation was codenamed Project Spotlight, a name that sounded innocent enough not to arouse suspicion, but carried the weight of a mission that could redefine the future of American politics. Bruckheimer took on the role of executive producer of the presidential twist, while the other directors divided themselves into specialties. Bay would be responsible for the impactful moments, Scott for the epic narrative arcs, and Nolan for the complex temporal structure of the events. "First, we need to identify the villains of the story," Bay said during the first planning meeting. "Every great narrative needs clear antagonists. We can't fight invisible enemies." The list was built methodically: foreign leaders who benefited from trade tensions, domestic politicians who sabotaged deals, media outlets that distorted narratives. Each villain would receive a specific cinematic treatment. Scott made a crucial point: the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are not just backdrops, they are narrative opportunities. The American public loves stories of leadership in times of crisis. "Imagine," Scott continued, his eyes shining with artistic vision, "Trump not as the politician who created trade problems, but as the leader who is navigating the most complex global storm since World War II." Nolan scribbled furiously on a notepad, creating diagrams that looked like maps from a spy movie. "We need a timeline that shows cause and effect. The tariffs were not mistakes, they were strategic moves in a much bigger game." "But how do we sell this narrative to an audience that has already formed an opinion?" asked the press officer, clearly skeptical about the viability of the plan. Bruckheimer leaned back in his chair, the confident smile of someone who had turned impossible projects into billion-dollar successes. "My friend, you're thinking like a politician. We think like storytellers." The strategy began to take shape, a series of carefully orchestrated revelations, each designed to recontextualize past actions and build momentum for the future. As the saying goes, truth is a matter of perspective. They proposed creating real cinematic moments, events that would be naturally dramatic and visually striking. "We need scenes that people will want to watch over and over again, share, discuss." "What if," Nolan suggested, "we create a narrative where Trump is not reacting to events, but anticipating them? Where every seemingly controversial move was actually a dimensional chess move?" The idea was audacious: to rewrite public perception not by denying the facts, but by recontextualizing them within a larger, more complex, more heroic narrative. Scott pounded the table with enthusiasm. "It's like Gladiator, the hero enters the arena not by choice but by necessity. The audience roots for the underdog, especially when he's fighting forces greater than himself." Trump listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his instinctive understanding of narrative. After all, he himself had been a television figure for decades before entering politics. So you're telling me, Trump said slowly, that instead of defending me, we're going to attack? Instead of explaining my actions, we're going to show why they were necessary? Exactly, the directors confirmed. And we're going to do it in a way that even its most ardent critics won't be able to ignore, because it will be impossible to ignore. The first phase of the operation was called Act 1, The Awakening. Like every great film, the story needed a moment that changed everything, and that moment arrived unexpectedly via an encrypted phone call at 3 a.m. Mr. President, the CIA director's voice sounded strained even over the secure line. We have intelligence on a coordinated operation. 3 different countries were manipulating American markets through the trade tensions their tariffs created. Bruckheimer, present in the Situation Room at the time, whispered to Trump, "This is your Luke, I am your father moment. The revelation that changes everything." The president nodded, immediately understanding the cinematic reference. Bay was already thinking about the visual elements. We need a press conference that feels like a political thriller. Documents being revealed, graphics showing connections, the tension building to the climactic reveal. The press conference was scheduled for 48 hours later, enough time for Scott to develop what he called a redemption arc. "It's not about admitting mistakes," he explained. "It's about revealing that there were no mistakes, just incomplete information." Nolan worked on the presentation's time frame. Let's start with the present, the crisis. Then we go back to the past, the decisions. Then we reveal the future, what would have happened without those decisions. Meanwhile, the international situation was intensifying. The war in Ukraine had escalated with new Russian attacks, and in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine were exchanging accusations over violations of a ceasefire that never really existed. "Perfect," Bay muttered, watching the news. International chaos is the ideal setting for a leader to show leadership. It's like Independence Day, when everything is falling apart, the president needs to unite the nation. The communications strategy was completely redesigned. Instead of defensive tweets, Trump would begin using language that Scott described as epic and visionary. Each statement would be constructed like a movie monologue. "Remember," Bruckheimer instructed during an Oval Office rehearsal, "you are not just running a country, you are starring in the most important story of the 21st century. Rise to the occasion." The new Trump's first scene was an impromptu speech during a visit to a factory in Ohio. Instead of talking about jobs and the economy, he spoke about protecting the American dream against forces most people don't even realize exist. The impact was immediate. Clips of the speech went viral not for the traditional political points, but for the cinematic intensity of the delivery. As the saying goes, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Nolan watched the engagement numbers with professional satisfaction. "We're creating what I call a political thriller. People want to know what's next, not because they agree or disagree, but because they're genuinely curious." Scott proposed the next phase: we need unexpected allies. Every hero needs mentors and companions. Who are the respected figures who can validate our narrative? The list included former presidents from both parties, retired military leaders, renowned economists, people whose credibility transcended partisan divides. Each would be approached not as a political supporter but as a supporting character in the larger story. Bay had a bolder proposal: what if we put on an event that was impossible to ignore? Something that would force even the most ardent critics to pay attention? "What kind of event?" Trump asked, already anticipating that the answer would be something no traditional politician would dare attempt. Bay's smile was the same one that had preceded some of cinema's most memorable action sequences. Something that transforms you from controversial politician to indispensable world leader. Something that makes the whole world stop and watch. The event that would change everything was internally dubbed Operation Convergence, a name Nolan chose for its ability to suggest multiple narrative threads meeting at a pivotal point in the story. The proposal was audacious beyond any political precedent. Trump would call an emergency summit not just with traditional allies, but with all the leaders involved in global conflicts, including Putin, Zelensky, Netanyahu, and Palestinian representatives. "You have completely lost your minds," the Secretary of State declared when the plan was presented. "This is not diplomacy, it is a circus. And if it fails, it will be the end of American credibility on the world stage." Bruckheimer leaned forward, his eyes shining with the confidence of someone who had taken on impossible projects before. My dear, all the great moments in history seemed like madness before they became legendary. This is the Normandy moment of the Trump presidency. Scott envisioned the scene as an historical epic. Imagine the images, world leaders gathered not in sterile conference rooms but in a setting that communicates the urgency of the moment. Camp David transformed into the stage of history. Bay was already planning the visual elements. We need helicopters arriving in sequence, flags waving, the palpable tension in the air. Each arrival will be a cinematic moment that people will remember forever. Nolan worked out the timeframe for the event, 3 days of negotiations, each day focused on a different conflict, but all connected by the same narrative that the world needs American leadership now more than ever. The first calls were made in the strictest confidence. Surprisingly, the response was more positive than anyone expected. As one veteran diplomat observed, when you are losing a war or facing international pressure, any opportunity for change seems attractive. The preparation was intense. Trump underwent what Bay described as protagonist training, sessions where he practiced not just what to say but how to position himself, how to use dramatic pauses, how to command a room full of the world's most powerful leaders. Remember, Scott instructed during one rehearsal, you are not just mediating conflicts, you are writing the final chapter of one era and the first of another. Every word, every gesture, will be analyzed for generations. 3 weeks before the event, something unexpected happened. Trump's approval ratings began to rise for the first time in months. The mere anticipation of what was to come had captured the public imagination in a way no traditional campaign had ever managed. It's the power of storytelling, Nolan explained, looking at the polls. People aren't supporting specific policies, they're emotionally invested in a story. They want to see how it ends. On the eve of the event, Trump stood in his room at Camp David, looking out the window at the final preparations. Bruckheimer approached, carrying the same calm energy that always preceded his greatest hits. Nervous? The producer asked. Trump smiled, the first genuine smile his aides had seen in months. No, he said. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The first helicopter landed at 9 a.m., carrying Zelensky. Cameras captured every second, the Ukrainian president stepping off the plane, Trump walking up to greet him, the handshake that symbolized much more than diplomatic courtesy. Throughout the day, the arrivals unfolded like scenes from a political thriller, Putin arriving with his signature entourage, Netanyahu and the Palestinian representatives in separate aircraft, each moment carefully choreographed for maximum visual impact. The ensuing negotiations were broadcast live in select portions, a decision by Bay that turned diplomacy into entertainment without trivializing its importance. The world watched, literally sitting on the edge of its seat. By the end of the third day, when Trump announced the preliminary agreements that had been reached, a ceasefire in Ukraine, renewed negotiations in the Middle East, and a new framework for international trade, his approval ratings had reached levels not seen since the beginning of his presidency. Months later, when historians tried to analyze how a presidency in freefall had become one of the most defining moments in modern diplomacy, they kept coming back to the same point. Sometimes the difference between failure and success is not what you do, but how you tell the story of what you were doing. And in this case, Hollywood had taught Washington how to tell the perfect story.